everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be a review of the new Netflix documentary, The Secret Tomb of Saqqara. I saw the trailer for this documentary a couple weeks ago and I just knew that I would have to feature it on this channel and not just preconceptions of archaeologists, and also it looks like the stuff that they are presenting in the documentary looks quite cool. I found out when I was kind of doing research for this film that it's produced by a company called Lion TV, who are actually the same people that produced the documentary Britain's Biggest Dig about HS2, the massive train project going on in the UK. So I think it's really interesting that they've got these kind of two documentaries about very similar subject matter, but are two very, very different documentaries. Neither Netflix, Lion TV, or the Egyptian Antiquities Department has sponsored or asked me to review this. I just thought it would be interesting for you guys to have an actual archaeologist watch a archaeology documentary and give her opinion on it. Before we get started, please make sure that you subscribe and hit the bell notification button to help support my channel. One of the things that got me really excited about this documentary was the fact that it's actually entirely an Egyptian-led team that is doing this excavation. It is a really big step in media towards decolonizing the image of archaeology and archaeologists. In this vein, almost the entire documentary is in Arabic with English subtitles. There is some English sprinkled in there in between bits, but it is largely in Arabic. So keep that in mind if you're someone that doesn't like to watch television with subtitles, but I don't think that that should be a reason for you to miss out on watching this program. Today's review is not going to exactly focus on the actual findings of the digs, partly because I don't want to spoil it for you guys. Also, I'm not really in a position to critique or speculate on the authenticity or dating or whatever of the finds that they're bringing up. While I very much would have loved to become an Egyptologist, I did not. And while my knowledge of Egyptology might be more than the average archaeologist in Britain, that still doesn't qualify me as an expert. So instead, I'm going to focus a bit more today on the filmmaking aspect of it, talking about what things I think are staged for the cameras, what things were filmed kind of like live, so to speak, what kind of choices they were definitely making and what they were showing in the filming, other little like archaeological Easter eggs that might be sprinkled throughout the film. I'm also not going to be doing like a scene for scene breakdown of the whole film, partly because of spoilers, but also because it's like 2 hours long. I don't really want to make a 2-hour video about this. The documentary itself focuses on a specific team and their excavation seasons in 2018 and 2019 at Saqqara. The tomb in the title of the documentary is a reference to the tomb of Wati, who was an Egyptian priest from the 5th dynasty of the Old Kingdom and had an incredibly well-preserved tomb that had not been previously looted. But there are also other things included in the documentary because they're not just excavating his tomb, they're doing kind of like the area around it. So there were discoveries happening around the tomb as well as in it. This includes things like a deposit of statuettes dedicated to the goddess Bast, a tomb of mummified cats, and other sarcophagi and small tomb discoveries. In case you didn't know, Saqqara is a large burial ground that is located to the southwest of Cairo and to the south of the Giza Plateau. It is probably most famous for the step pyramid of the pharaoh Djoser from the 3rd dynasty in the Old Kingdom of Egypt. I've actually been to Saqqara myself and I've seen the step pyramid in person and the big burial complex that is around that. It's a very impressive sight to see, and I would highly recommend if you are going on a tour of Egypt to see it. While the most famous feature of Saqqara is the Old Kingdom step pyramid, it was a burial ground that was used throughout the history of what we know as ancient Egypt. So it has stuff from the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, the late period, up to the Hellenistic and Roman period. The first thing I definitely noticed when I was kind of scrutinizing the documentary was that, as all documentaries, it definitely uses a mix of what I would call live and staged footage. Or at least it seems like that to me. I could be wrong, but I'm fairly confident I'm right. This was especially obvious to me on kind of like the very first scene of the documentary, where they have a worker digging in a shaft or a shaft tomb, and he stops, he uncovers something, he asks the boss, the archaeologist, to come down and look at it. The position that the camera is in this shot to me indicates that this whole bit had already been cleared and they were kind of just like staging this for dramatic effect. There are also a few scenes that they cut and intersperse throughout the documentary that, when you look back at them, have definitely all been filmed at at one time, and in my opinion, for the benefit of the cameras. The reason I think these are staged is because it doesn't make sense to me and what I know of archaeological field work and processes for the things that are being done, and these seems to be done directly on site. One of the two scenes I'm talking about in particular is where the hieroglyphics experts Nareem and Nabil, who don't get any other credentials besides their names, which is another feature of the documentary I thought was quite weird. I would have thought they would have given everyone like their full academic titles or qualifications or whatever. But they are basically going through the tomb and trying to read the hieroglyphics and decipher them before the team can get in and start excavating the shaft burials that are underneath the tomb chapel. I don't think that this is how they would have actually done it. It just doesn't make sense to me, because going around a tomb with a flashlight and a notebook seems to me quite an old-fashioned and inefficient way of doing things when we have the kind of technology that we have nowadays with like DSLR and photogrammetry, and being able to take incredibly detailed photographs of these tombs that you can then stitch together, look at a computer, and piece together outside of the tomb, especially when we have a lot of concerns with light damage in regards to tomb paintings. So to me, I think probably they would have already kind of deciphered a lot of this, and then they would have kind of made a scene of them doing it on site just to kind of make it seem a bit more exciting. The same applies to the scene with Dr. Amina. Her actual like title and position on the dig is a bit unclear, because she is a doctor associated with a school of rheumatology in Cairo, but then they also call her an anthropologist. I would call her more of an osteoarchaeologist, but I suppose that doesn't really matter. Either way, she's the person that looks at the bones that they pull up from the tomb of Wachi. And the scene that they use from her has clearly been filmed all at one time, and it involves her basically laying out the skeletal remains of the occupants of this tomb and brushing them off, talking about them, and then talking a little bit about what she thinks the bones are telling her about these people. In my experience, when you excavate human remains, you will separate them according to anatomy, put them in bags, take them back to a lab where they get cleaned, and then you will have all of this space to lay them out properly so that you can record what you know about them. To me, the scene where she's basically laid them all out on the floor of the tomb just seems like a really inefficient use of space, especially if they are still digging or doing stuff within the tomb. You can't just, like, that's gonna be really difficult for people to walk around and not crush. Like, lighting would not be that great for her. It's not like they're probably allowed to have like flood lamps in there because of the potential damage to the paintings. I can't imagine that it's very easy to see what's going on, so I definitely think that that was staged for the cameras. Every dig that I've been on, both in the UK and in Jordan, has taken human remains off-site and examined them somewhere else rather than doing it on-site. If you're trying to look for scenes that are definitely filmed live, for me, I think the best way to tell is when you can see a photo scale in the shot. So if you can see a like bar that alternates red and white, or like red and black squares, that can pretty much guarantee that you're probably seeing something that was getting filmed as it was happening, because that is a scale that we use to take photographs as they are discovered. When you don't see photo scales and scenes and people are picking things up and handling them, to me that indicates that this is all being done for the cameras a bit retroactively. Things I liked about this documentary, 100% really happy about the fact that the team that was featured in this was Egyptian. The fact that everybody spoke Arabic, as I said before, I think that's a really important narrative to be showing of Egyptians kind of reclaiming their heritage back from all of the white Westerners who for a long time have been coming into Egypt with their pith helmets and directing digs and taking all of the credit for these discoveries. I also really like that this is quite a short time frame that we go from the actual discoveries to them being publicized in the media, or at least presented publicly, because I'm sure the publications are probably still a couple of years off because they have field seasons still to go. But it's nice to see archaeological discoveries being presented not 20 years or 10 years or whatever after they actually happened. I really enjoyed the scenes where they make connections between the life of modern day Egyptians and that of ancient Egyptians, kind of trying to show that human element of, you know, in a lot of ways they were just like us. They might not have had our technology, they might not have spoken the same language, but their day-to-day in a lot of ways was really similar to us, and that really helps you see them as people. I felt a lot of sympathy for the team as well in the few different scenes where they mentioned things about funding from the government for the project running out, or the field season being about to finish and they needed to make sure that they got all this stuff done in time. That is definitely not something that is faked for the cameras. Funding is a real issue in archaeology, and with something like a 6-week field season, you are going to have certain goals and you need to make sure that you get things to a certain state where you can leave them for another year until you can come back to the site. So there is definitely a lot of pressure to make sure that you're getting things to a state that you're happy with towards the end of a dig. And it also does sometimes happen that deadlines get shifted around and you suddenly find out that something that you thought you were going to have a couple weeks to do, you now have until Friday. So a lot of sympathy for the team, and well done with everything that they managed to accomplish when their deadlines got changed on them. The fact that the team was a mix of both men and women gets a big thumbs up from me. It's another representation of diversity and inclusivity in archaeology that I'm very happy that we have on such a big platform like Netflix. I really related to the scenes where they talked about the rush, or that feeling that you get when you touch something that no one else has handled or looked at or seen for thousands of years. I have had that feeling myself when I've been digging, and I just really in particular loved the scene with Samira, the funerary archaeologist and zoo archaeologist, when she is looking at the x-rays of these mummified cats and is getting like teary-eyed talking about how significant they are and how they really change what we know about ancient Egypt. That kind of passion about archaeology I am like all here for. Now for the bits that kind of made me go, Probably the biggest thing that was kind of making my jaw drop when I was watching this documentary wasn't the amazing discoveries, the preservation, and etc. It was almost the complete lack of any kind of visible health and safety measures on site, bar a brief scene where they talk about stabilizing the tomb so that people can dig in it. Obviously, the way things are done in Egypt and on research projects is very different to how things are done on commercial archaeology UK projects, where they are essentially construction sites. So I'm aware of that disparity. But if you look at Lion TV's other big archaeology documentary, Britain's Biggest Dig, about HS2, which is a government-funded infrastructure project, there is a massive difference between what you see in terms of health and safety for the archaeologists. On HS2, they are dressed in full traffic cone PPE, trousers, vests, shirts, etc. They've all got hard hats on, they all have goggles, they'll all be wearing gloves. They all have to have a construction safety certification scheme card. The big excavation area, you'll see that the sides are stepped in. When they're doing the trial trenches, you'll see that all the sides of the trenches are like stabilized with steel and rebar and scaffolding. This is to prevent collapse onto the archaeologists so that nobody gets buried alive. There's safety fencing everywhere, and that is pretty standard for archaeological sites in the UK that are run in the private and commercial sector. Volunteer sites may be run a bit differently. For me and someone who's experienced that for 6 years, there's like a huge difference. If you then contrast it to this site in Egypt, which is being run on government funding and is a research project, it's just like the complete opposite. Nobody's wearing high-vis. There are people walking around either barefoot or in sandals. There are people smoking on site as they're digging. There's no hard hats whatsoever. I saw in one particular scene a guy lifting a mattock, like a pick, above his head to dig. That is a huge no-no in UK archaeology, especially when you're not wearing a hard hat, because if you are lifting this big piece of metal and wood above your head and you lose your grip, you can like have it fall on your head, or if you let it go too far back, you're like, it could get hit here. I don't like to think about it. When you see them going into the different shafts and everything of the tombs, nobody's wearing hard hats or gloves or safety wear. The one guy it looked like they were going to just be like lowering him into a shaft tomb with like a rope tied around his waist. Which is not what ended up happening. They were using like a pulley system, but I was just looking at that, I was like, that's what you're using? To be fair, a hard hat is not going to protect you if a tomb collapses while you are in it, but it's still also a very cramped space. And I would imagine that a hard hat would probably go a long way to keeping you from smacking your head off of the ceiling and potentially giving yourself a bit of a head injury. The conditions on this site are very similar in terms of health and safety to what they were on my field schools in Jordan. We also had workers walking around barefoot or in sandals. We didn't have hard hats, we didn't have vis vests or anything. I'm not trying to bash anybody for that, but after working in field archaeology in the UK for 6 years, this is probably the part of the documentary that threw me for the biggest loop when I was watching it. I was just waiting every time they showed a shot of the workers kind of digging out this big sand cliff face, and they were showing like runnels of sand running down and everything. I was just waiting for the soil to like collapse and there to be an accident on site. Luckily, to my knowledge, nothing actually happened, and maybe they do have measures in place that they just didn't show on camera because nobody besides me probably finds that interesting. But I was just kind of like watching that being like, oh God. While I was very happy to see the inclusion of the 3 female experts within the documentary, I did find it really interesting / mildly disappointing that none of them are actually in active field roles. So they're all kind of what I would consider like consultants. They're working on like the post-excavation phase. They're not actually actively involved in the excavation that's going on. They're analyzing the results of what's happened afterwards. There is not a single woman that's actually involved, that we see, that's involved with the actual like digging part of the project. And I also think that their inclusion of these 3 women in the documentary was very, very deliberate to make up for that. In a way, not that they wouldn't have been involved either way. And obviously, way back when they were developing this project, they wouldn't have like created their project team thinking like, oh, we need to have a woman in charge because it looks good. Fair enough. But personally for me, it would have been nice to see a woman in a position of authority on the field team. The archaeologist and like the 2 kind of dig directors are both men. That doesn't mean that there aren't female Egyptologists and archaeologists leading digs. I just didn't see them in this documentary, and that would have been nice. Besides the health and safety, my other biggest gripe about this film is how it portrays the act of discovery in a way. There's a lot of different shots, especially in the first half, of people digging, dusting something off, and then just like picking it out of the ground and looking at it and taking it out and doing all this stuff to it. That is not how things are done in the field. This is definitely something that I think was deliberately edited and cut this way to try and appeal to an audience, because the actual process that would have went on behind the scenes was probably something that only archaeologists would be interested in. I have no doubt that the archaeologists on this dig followed due process like the rest of us when they did find something, which basically involves that when you find an object in situ in the ground, you will clean off the area around it, put a photo scale down, take a photo of it, and record where it is actually like distributed on the site or in like the shaft or whatever that you're digging. So sometimes this is done by GPS, sometimes this is done by drawing it on a plan, a notation, whatever. And then you take it out and you remove it and you keep going. Obviously for the cameras, showing that whole process perhaps is just too boring. So they just kind of make it look like anytime you find something, you just kind of like brush it off and then you just scoop it up and do that. The provenience or location and all that information related to that of an object is equally as important as the object itself that you found. The overall preservation of everything related to this documentary really blew me away. That dry desert climate is really, really, really good for making sure that you have excellently preserved material. But in particular, the tomb paintings with all of the like beautiful bright colors. I really like that you got to see that. When you go around to archaeological sites in Egypt nowadays, all of the paintings of the temples and these different places like Karnak, they've all been worn away by time. They've not been maintained, so you just end up seeing these big stone structures. We tend to think of their architecture and like their arts as kind of very, I think, bland in some ways. You know, it's all about everything being like brown, white with gold and maybe like some turquoise and blue, whereas they definitely took advantage of as much of the spectrum of paint colors that were available to them at that time. The animated scenes that they show that demonstrate and explain how the Egyptians viewed their afterlife, I thought those were absolutely stunningly done. They are really beautiful. And based on the fact that the ending of this was a bit of a cliffhanger, I won't tell you what it is, but I look forward to potentially being able to see the next incarnation of this documentary once they are hopefully allowed back into the field after COVID-19. I'd be interested to know what effect COVID-19 might have had on this project in terms of maybe like funding or being able to get out in the field. Overall, I would really recommend this to everyone who tunes into my channel. Clearly you have an interest in archaeology, particularly if you are very interested in ancient Egypt. I would say that this is a really excellent documentary to watch. It represents archaeology really, really well. And it also, like I said, is a really great representation of modern day archaeology and steps that people are making to decolonize archaeology and the image of archaeology that is shown to the public. And I also am really 100% behind the message of the film in that it makes a very deliberate statement a couple times that it's not just about finding gold. It's about finding out about the lives and trials and tribulations of these people that lived thousands of years ago and making a connection with them. Have you guys watched the documentary? Is it on your list of things to watch? If you have watched it, did you enjoy it? Did you notice any of the stuff that I talked about here today? Would you be interested in watching the next part of it once they end up going back into the field? Just recently announced that they found a cache of like over 80 incredibly well-preserved coffins at Saqqara. I'm not sure if that's related to this project or not, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see a documentary about that maybe in a year or two. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As per usual, my social media is in the description box if you would like to follow me on there. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up to help support my channel. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye!